Hi there. Um, I am finally getting around to making this video for Chapter 8 over adolescence. And I just want you to know I have tried to make this video 5 times today, and every single time I'm in the middle of it, I get interrupted. And when you're making a video like this, if you get interrupted, you have to stop it and start over. So here it is after 10 o'clock at night. I am finally, hopefully, going to get the full thing recorded for you, and I'm hoping not many of you have already completed Chapter 8. If you have, maybe you're taking advantage of going back and watching this video. So first, before we get into the actual material, I want to go through and make sure everybody knows where we are in Canvas. So I have, I should say, so you can see me on this video, right? Which is a little different than what I've done before, and not my favorite thing to do. I don't like to video myself, but sometimes it's nice to be able to see the person that you're listening to and not just hearing their voice from behind the screen. So maybe it'll help you pay attention. I'd rather you be looking at the documents instead of me, but whatever. Okay, so let's scroll down. We're on Unit 3, which is chapters 7 through 10. And, well, let's just see right here, the paper. I hope you're all working on it because that's something that you all have to do. So, haven't heard much from you lately. I hope that means you're hard at work. So, if you have questions, don't hesitate to reach out and ask me. So Unit 3, like I said, covers chapters 7 through 10. Chapter 7, I pretty much left that as an independent chapter with you working through the material with some of the resources that I provided for extra support, but without a video or audio or anything like that. Well, there's video, but not me. I do want to say in the discussion, the reflective discussion, somebody had the idea of vocabulary flashcards. I don't remember who that was, but that was a great idea. So I didn't go out and create those for you, but I did go out on Quizlet and do some searching, and I found some video flashcards that someone had created that seemed aligned with our textbook and what we're learning over each chapter. So I added those to this unit, so you have right here at Chapter 7 Vocab Quizlet. You can use that for your practice, your study, and that's also available in Chapter 8. So that's what we're on tonight is Chapter 8, Adolescence, and this file right here that says Chapter 8 Student Notes, that's what we're going to be going through for this lecture. I'm going to pull it up so we can follow it along. I'm going to move this over just a hair. Let me get back up to the top. Okay, so I'm not going to do a lot of extemporaneous speaking on this. I'm pretty much just going to follow the notes, and what I would suggest, best case scenario, you print out the notes and you follow along and fill in the blanks as we go. But there are several pages, so printing them might not be an option for you. So if that's the case, what I would suggest is get a piece of paper and follow along. You're looking at the notes, you're listening to me, and write down what goes in the blanks. And then later you can go open the notes in your Word document and type in what goes in the blanks, maybe put it in a different font color or whatever, and use that to study for Chapter 8. Okay, adolescence. Obviously a very, a time of upheaval, a time of change, a lot's happening as far as development goes during adolescence. And some of you are going through adolescence right now. Others of you have already been through adolescence, and maybe you look back and think, wow, I'm really glad not to be going through that stage of life anymore, or maybe you have some fond memories of it. But regardless, adolescence is a very unique stage. So the way these notes are, they're divided like the sections in the book with the 3 parts of development: physical, cognitive, and social emotional. So we're going to start with the physical, and we're just, like I said, we're just going to go through this, and I'll add a little bit of dialogue, but mostly we'll just be going through the notes. So, adolescence begins with the first notable changes of puberty. And we all know what puberty is, and we're going to talk about some of the characteristics of puberty as we talk about adolescence. So, puberty changes the adolescent's anatomy, physiology, and physical appearance. We know there's hormonal changes, there's a lot happening chemistry wise. Sex hormone production of estrogen and androgens increases when adolescents cross a body fat threshold that triggers chemical events that begin in the hypothalamus. So when we talk about those hormones, there's two classes of sex hormones. We have estrogens and androgens. And the most important estrogen is estradiol. And the most important androgen is the one that we think about when we think about guys, and that's testosterone. As far as in children before they hit puberty, these levels of hormones are about the same. They're pretty much equal, and it's not until puberty hits that we see the rise in estradiol in girls and testosterone in boys. Okay, so we talk about different types of sex characteristics, and there's two categories. So first we're going to talk about primary sex characteristics, and to be a primary sex characteristic, it has to be directly related to reproduction. So we're talking about eggs or ova in females and sperm in males. So that's what it takes to reproduce, those two things. So interesting note, you may know this already, but if you don't, I know last semester I was teaching this class, and one of my students, she said, I didn't know that. That is so fascinating. Females are born with all the eggs that they will ever have. So if you're a girl, when you were born, all the eggs that you're ever going to have, they're already there in you. You're not producing eggs every month. However, guys, that's not the case for you. You actually do start producing sperm. But for girls, the term that we use to describe the first menstrual period is called menarche, menarche. And that's when, like I said, girls would have their first menstrual cycles. Males begin to produce sperm, which is called spermarche, around age 12. Okay, so that's primary sex characteristics. And then we shift over and talk about secondary sex characteristics, which are also very important, a big part of puberty. And those involve other bodily changes, such as the growth of more body hair, including pubic hair, and a lowering of the voice, and increased production of oils and sweat and that sort of thing. All those lovely things that happen to us as we go through puberty. So at the beginning of puberty, there's a sharp increase in the synaptic connections, a process called overproduction or exuberance, and that's concentrated here in the frontal lobes, which, by the way, your frontal lobe is not fully developed until around age 25. So teenagers, frontal lobe is not quite done growing yet. So overproduction in those synapses, it peaks around 11 or 12 years old. And then this next term we've talked about before, and that's synaptic pruning. Synaptic pruning, remember we talked about the row of carrots where you pull out lots of the carrots to make room for the ones you leave behind to be able to grow bigger and stronger. So synaptic pruning, that happens after overproduction of those synapses. You've got all those synapses developing and there's booming, and then you've got to go weed some of them out. So the ones that need to stay and be stronger have room to do that. Let's see. So we're right here, and for this blank, it's myelination, and that's another important process of the brain development in adolescence. And here the cerebellum, which is part of the hindbrain, it shows growth during adolescence and into emerging adulthood, which we'll talk about in another chapter. and that helps regulate some higher brain functions. And the cerebellum is the last structure in the brain to stop growing. Okay, so page 2, the rate, timing, and order of puberty varies greatly among individuals. So when we talk about what causes the variation, one thing that seems to make a difference is nutrition. And then it says further evidence in the role of nutrition in medical care in puberty timing comes from cultural comparisons in the present. So the average age of menarche is lowest in developed countries. So that's going to be the United States, Canada, Europe, our developed countries. Girls are going to start puberty earlier, so at lower age. What do you think? Any guesses? Well, it's, let's see, it's about 12 years old. And then in developing countries, it's higher, so it happens later in life, and the average there is about 15 years old, and we're talking about girls. So, and basically the way that cultures respond to puberty and all the changes and how they react to this stage of life, it varies from culture to culture. Research consistently shows there are some effects of early maturation. So if a girl matures early, if they hit puberty early, they grow faster than their friends, and suddenly they're the ones that are getting more attention. They feel more awkward because their body has suddenly changed, but yet their friends are still exactly how they used to be. So for girls, early maturation tends to be a negative thing. They look different. People treat them differently because they start to look older. They start to have more depressed mood, negative body image, eating disorders, substance abuse, delinquency, aggressive behavior, problems in school, problems with parents. So overall, if a girl matures early, it tends to affect them more negatively. What about for boys? What do you think? Is that going to be the same as for girls? For boys, the early maturation process, it actually is mixed results. So there are things that are positive about it or can lead to positive things, and then there are also things that are negative. I've got the fan going in the house and it's blowing in my eyes, so hopefully I can get through this. So for boys, it's positive because suddenly they appear more manly and more what they would consider attractive. They've reached a stage where they look less like a boy and more like a man, but that tends to lead to them getting involved earlier in delinquency and criminal activity. So here we are, late maturing boys suffer from problems with criminal activity and delinquency. No, I'm sorry. Delinquency would be the same as criminal activity, although maybe not so severe. This should be substance abuse and delinquency. Obviously, that's not it's not something that happens with every boy who matures early. It just seems to, we'll use our term, has a high correlation with that. So late maturing girls who hit puberty later, they tend not to have problems. They don't have negative side effects from developing later or negative self-image from developing later. Puberty rituals are formal ways that different cultures mark the entrance into puberty. And there's some interesting cultures out there. So if you wanted to delve into that a little bit, you could, some of it is covered in the book. You could also do some of your own research and see how different cultures mark that stage of life. Adolescents are typically healthy for the most part, and most often it's not physical illness, but rather inappropriate behavior that puts their health at risk. So we know sometimes teenagers make choices that aren't the best, for them and for their health. So that's typically the problem as far as health risks for them. Let's talk about eating disorders, because sadly that is a problem in our nation and the Western culture specifically. So let's talk about body image. So if I tell you that 31% of boys and girls that are adolescent age, let's say 31% of those are overweight or obese, what percentage of girls or boys do you think believe that they're overweight or obese? Do you think just that 31% says, yeah, I am, and it's right? I think we all know it's probably going to be higher. So our percentages here is in the United States, 60% of girls and 30% of boys believe that they're overweight, when in reality only 31% of them actually are. So then we talk about different specific eating disorders. So the first one, anorexia nervosa, is intentional self-starvation, and it's also a very distorted body image. They're starving themselves, but at the same time when they look in the mirror, they still see themselves as fat, even when they lose weight, even when they're not. So anorexia nervosa is intentional starvation. And then the other one that we talk about is bulimia, and that's where they binge eat and they purge as a way to try to regulate their body, their weight. Excuse me. So the rates of substance abuse are fairly common by the end of secondary school, and by the end of secondary school we mean high school. Most substance use in adolescence centers around, what do you think? Three things, the three biggies: alcohol, cigarettes, marijuana. Adolescent substance abuse can fall into one of four categories. We have experimental, social, medicinal, or addictive. And that's pretty much self-explanatory, but the next page has the definitions of those. So let's go over those real quick. In experimental substance abuse, the young people, they do just that. They experiment, they try it, they see what they think about it, and then they put it down and set it aside. In social substance abuse, they tend to do it only in social settings. I'm going to hang out with my friends, we're going to drink, or we're going to smoke, or whatever, but it's just what I do when I hang out with my friends. So the social substance use. And then the next one is medicinal, and that's when they use it to try to cover up some kind of pain, unpleasant emotion, or feeling. It could be physical pain, but at this age range, it's going to be more emotional, social, that type of thing. So that's medicinal. And then the last one is, of course, addictive, and that's when they can't do without it. And it kind of goes without saying, but I'm going to say it anyway. Any one of those first three can lead to addictive behavior depending on how it progresses. So obviously the addictive substance abuse is the one that can really alter a person's life and create obstacles and things that prevent them from being able to lead a normal life, because at that point they truly can't live without it and function normally. Okay, so that's physical development. So we're switching gears for our second section, and we're going to talk about cognitive development. And cognitive, remember, we're talking about what's happening in the mind, in the brain. So here we have our good friend Piaget, and we go back and we talk about Piaget's theory of formal operations. So according to Piaget, formal operations is the period of development from about 11 years old to 20, and that's where adolescents learn to think logically. Let me get that off of here. Oops, where did I go? Okay, here we go. Um, where adolescents learn to think logically or sequentially about complex tasks. They're not just, as it says in this next paragraph, you have a problem, and the younger children, they're just experimenting. They're just, I'm gonna try this, and I'm gonna try this, and I'm gonna try something until whatever I try works. It's not the same as once they get into that formal operations way of thinking. They're faced with a problem, and they can analyze the problem in some way and come up with a logical, okay, I'm going to try this. And then they can reflect on that and say, well, that didn't work. Why didn't it work? And what could I try differently that might work better? So the way their mind is working and thinking, it's changing, it's developing, it's growing. So that's what Piaget called formal operations. In addition, attention, memory, executive function, all of those things are getting better by the time we reach that stage of adolescence. Adolescents become more proficient at selective attention, and that's the ability to focus on one thing even when other things are going on around you. And I know you all have faced having to do that, and some of you probably are better at it than others, but it's something that you have the ability to do because you're there, you're able to do it. So don't use that as an excuse. Don't say you can't. Adolescents also get better at tasks that require divided attention, which is when your ability to focus on relevant information. I'm sorry, not real. I'm backing up. More than one thing at a time. So in today's language, a lot of times you'll hear that be said, multitasking. But just remember, you may say I can multitask, but in reality, studies show that the efficiency of both tasks, if you're multitasking, maybe you're performing at this level for both of them. But if you were to focus on just one task, you're going to be up here. So multitasking, you can do it, but you're not going to be as efficient in either task or any task that you're doing simultaneously as you would be if you gave all of your attention to one and then switched to the next one. That doesn't mean there are times that sometimes we simply have to multitask. Okay. Cognitive development in adolescence includes the development of what's called metacognition, and that's a key term for metacognition is the capacity to think about thinking. And I don't know if you've been taught or trained, but let me just throw in this nugget here. Learning what root words mean and knowing how words are combined for prefixes, suffixes, and roots, you can learn how to recognize the meaning of a word without knowing it, but simply by looking at the parts of the word and what they mean. So metacognition, that's one of those examples where I probably shouldn't have given that example because I can't remember exactly what the prefix meta means, but we know cognition is talking about thinking. So if you can get down to that part, you're gonna be able to understand what you're talking about better. Anyway, side note. So, but let me get back on track. Adolescent egocentrism, and that's, I'm going to spell it for you, EGOCENTRICISM. Egocentrism affects the adolescent's ability to distinguish thinking about their own thoughts from their thinking about the thoughts of others. So basically, ego, they're thinking about themselves, and they can't stop focusing on themselves because For an adolescent, in some respects, the world revolves around them. Everything is magnified. So the next one, and you probably can all relate to this either currently or in your past. The imaginary audience is the adolescent's limited capacity to distinguish between their own self-referencing thoughts and their thinking about the thoughts of others. So basically what that says, those 2 bullet points, is they end up thinking that others are thinking about them quite a bit. So and then that, believing that others are always looking at them, always thinking about them, always talking about them, this idea that they have this imaginary audience out there that's focused on them, it makes them more self-conscious. It makes them hypersensitive to things that maybe aren't even reality, because in their mind that imaginary audience is real. And so that's why middle school and early high school can be pretty tough, because we have definitely an increase in conflict or problems between people. I know, especially if you're still in high school, you can understand that we have students who come in, well, she was talking about me, she was over there, they were talking, they were looking at me, I'm just not going to take that kind of thing. Super increase in those adolescent years, and it's because of that imaginary audience that we're talking about. Okay, so scrolling down to the bottom of that page of notes, the personal fable is an adolescent's belief in his or her own personal uniqueness. So what that means is that encapsulates their idea that they're invincible or invulnerable to consequences. So basically the idea of, well, it's not going to happen to me. And they tend to take more risk. And that's why we said before that their behavior is more of a health risk to them than anything else, because they believe in that personal fable, that they're so unique that they don't, that the consequences don't apply to them. Okay, shifting, here we go, next page. Shifting to secondary school is a major transition for children. So secondary school, we're talking about middle school, high school age. A lot of times move into a different school, different expectations, academic rigor goes up. So it's a rough time. It's a time of not only those physical changes and emotional and cognitive changes that they're dealing with in their own personal life, but then their physical life also is different. They're going to a new environment. Everything is just upside down during this time of life. So talking about the different cultures and how they approach schooling, most European countries take a different approach with 3 different types of secondary schools. So we're talking about European countries, not just Western or developed countries. About 50% of adolescents attend a university prep school, and about 25% attend a vocational school, and then the other 25% attend a professional school. So they pretty much put them in tracks depending on what their long-term goal or their predisposed abilities as they would think. In developing countries, so we're talking about the poorer nations, kids don't go to secondary school. Primary school is about it, and a lot of times in those countries the kids are working with the families. They're out working to try to sustain life. Eastern schools focus almost exclusively on what's called rote learning, and that's ROTE. They have longer school days, cram schools. They tend to do a better job in those entrance exams and that sort of thing. So Eastern schools, rote learning, knowledge. I'm cramming that knowledge in. Western schools, and that's us, that's the United States and this side of the world, we tend to focus more on critical thinking and creativity. And um, in your own schooling, perhaps you can tell that there's a lot of talk about thinking creatively and maybe think outside the box and think critically, higher order thinking skills, that sort of thing. Um, all right, so now for the last section, we're talking about emotional and social development. Um, Adolescent self-concepts involve their distinguishing what's called an actual self and their possible selves. So this is kind of an interesting concept, and you probably can relate to it, although you may not have thought about it in these terms. So research has noted that two different versions of possible selves. So when you think about your possible self, that's exactly what it sounds like. Who could I be? And the two different possible selves include the ideal self, the one you would like to be, and then the feared self. So that's more of like, oh man, I hope I don't turn out like that. And sadly, sometimes that's the feared self is, for example, a bad role model in an adolescent's life. It could even be a parent. I've watched my parent make all these mistakes, and I'm just really afraid that I'm going to do the same things because that's what I've seen. And so that's the feared self. So the ideal self and the feared self. Okay, an adolescent becomes aware of times when he or she is exhibiting a fake self. So that's basically when you pretend to be something that you're not, and that's not what you are, but you do it anyway, usually for social acceptability. And it says in studies, adolescents tend to justify or say that, a little bit of that fake self is okay because, like on social media, that's what everybody does. So it's justified in part. Self-esteem declines in early adolescence, and then eventually it climbs back up, but it declines in early adolescence. Self-esteem definitely takes a hit during this stage of life. Let's talk about a theory real quick. Cognitive developmental theory of moral reasoning. That's by Lawrence Kohlberg, and it's Kohlberg. Based on his findings, he developed a universal framework with 3 levels of moral development. So the idea of what's right and wrong, that were then divided into 2 stages each. So level 1, according to him, he called it pre-conventional reasoning. And that's based on external rewards and punishments. So during that time, it's early in the moral development, and you can think of a young child with their actions as far as what's right and wrong. They're going to avoid doing what they know they get punished for, and they're going to do what they know they're going to get rewarded for. So simplistically, we're talking about, I'm going to get a spanking, so I'm not going to do that. Or my mommy's going to give me a sticker if I do this, so I'm going to do it. It doesn't have anything to do with that child's feelings about what they're doing or that they believe it's right. It's just on, am I going to get that sticker, or how do I avoid that spanking? So that's pre-conventional. The level 2, so we're moving up, we're learning more morals, is what he called conventional reasoning, and that is basically conforming to what the society's expectations are, their moral expectations. And then finally, so when we say, so for that stage, it's not just I'm going to get punished or I'm going to get rewarded. It's this is what I know is socially acceptable. So therefore, to conform, to fit in with my culture, I'm going to do this behavior or I'm going to avoid that behavior. And then finally, the third level, which I think he would argue maybe not everybody actually even gets to, but that's called the post-conventional reasoning, and that's based on personal values. And a person at that highest level is going to be able to say, perhaps everyone around me is doing something, and I could conform and go along with that they're doing, which would be the conventional reasoning, but it goes against my core values. So I'm going to break from the social norm that I'm in, and I'm going to do this thing because I know it's what's right for me. So that's the post-conventional level. That's obviously the highest level. And then we have cultural development theory. Researchers who use this approach code people's responses to moral issues according to three types of ethics, and those are rooted in worldviews. So, why do people do what they do? Why do they act morally? We're talking about morals. Why do they act morally the way they do? And the first category would be the ethics of autonomy, and that's where the individual, what's best for you, what I want for me is the core, the key deciding factor. And then the next one is ethics of community. So that's where you feel compelled to look out for your fellow man, taking care of those around you and commitments. And then finally, the ethic of divinity, and that's for spiritual reasons. If someone is making a moral decision or acting on morals based on their spiritual reasons, that would fall under the ethics of divinity as far as what they would call it. Okay, adolescents and emerging adults in developed countries are less religious and tend to be more secular than those in developing countries. But that varies based on ethnicity, so that's not true across the board. And actually, when we talk about America and Americans are more religious than people in virtually any other developed country. But religion has a lower priority for most American adolescents than any other parts of their lives. So, although as a whole, Americans are more religious than other countries, when you're talking about an adolescent, if you were to carve up every piece of that adolescent's life, spirituality, as a general rule, is going to be a much smaller sliver than many other things as far as what they think is important in their life. Friends are going to be a huge sliver. I'm sorry, not a sliver, a huge chunk. Technology, maybe. Activities, that sort of thing. Those things are going to take up a lot more of that pie than religion for most adolescents. Okay, across American culture groups, adolescents who are more religious report less depression and lower rates of premarital sex, drug use, and delinquent behavior. So studies show that a person who is religious or more religious, they're gonna have fewer problems in these areas. For adolescents, although family relations are still part of daily life, there's a decrease in the amount of time that they actually spend with their family. And you know this. Who do you spend time with the most? Most adolescents spend more time with their friends than they do with their family. Kind of sad if you think about it, but at the same time, it's a natural way of things in our culture. Studies of adolescents in Western countries show that conflict with their parents increases sharply during early adolescence, and it remains high for several years. But then once late adolescence gets here, they start to get along with them a little better. So if you're still in the middle of that, fighting with your parents all the time, it will get better, and your parents are thankful for that, and no, you're thankful for that. So why is there more conflict during those adolescent years? Well, as an adolescent, you're reaching sexual maturity. That's a whole different world. That's a different than what you experienced before puberty. You have a better ability to argue and reason, and you desire autonomy or independence. And your parents are concerned about your risky behavior, your poor choices, because remember, you have that personal fable where you don't believe that those consequences apply to you, and your behavior is your highest health risk. So parents are going to be concerned about that. And so you have kid, parent, and you've got problems. But it does get better. So hang in there. Hang in there, whether you're an adolescent or whether you're a parent. In traditional cultures, and we are on getting close to the end, almost to the end. In traditional cultures, it is almost impossible, not almost impossible, it should be probably very rare for parents and adolescents to have conflicts like what we have in the Western culture. It just doesn't happen. Their culture is different. And actually, the idea of teenager doesn't exactly exist in developing countries, because as soon as they're old enough to contribute to the family and working and being part of sustaining life, that's what they're doing. For American and European adolescents, the quality and quantity of familial relationships decline as they become closer to their what? You're not closer to your family anymore, you're closer to your friends. Adolescents start to depend more on their friends for their companionship, for their intimacy, and their leisure time, their fun activities, less on family. This is somewhat of a trend in traditional cultures, but only for boys. However, they do spend more time with their families than their counterparts in Western cultures. Right here on this one, this should be intimacy, which is the most distinctive feature of adolescent friendship. And what intimacy is, it's the degree to which you share your true self, your personal knowledge, your thoughts, your feelings with someone. When you open up and it's a way of being vulnerable with somebody. You share the true you. That's intimacy. So a lot of times people hear the term intimacy, and they think sexual relations. Well, that's not what intimacy is. Intimacy is relationship, and what it's all about is sharing yourself with someone else. Adolescents fall into two social groups, crowds and cliques. Cliques are those small groups of friends that hang out together and do things regularly, and crowds are larger groups that basically labels of different types of large groups of teenagers or adolescents. So it lists some here: jocks, preppies, nerds, burnouts, or nobodies. I'm not sure that's the terminology we would use, but you get the picture. Cliques and crowds. Bullying involves intentional, repeated, aggressive behavior toward a person that's less powerful. So I know bullying, that's something that's thrown around a lot, and there's an actual definition. So bullying is not something that happens just once. It does have to be repeated to actually be bullying, but it can be very serious. A specific type of bullying that involves electronic devices, where a person maybe makes posts on social media or sends texts or emails harassing or putting the person down. What's that called? What kind of bullying is electronic? Well, it's cyberbullying. As adolescents get older, they are more likely to have experienced a romantic relationship. Romantic love appears to have universal appeal to young people. Imagine that. although not all of them are free to act on their feelings. So when we talk about, well, they're not free to act, it's what's the culture, what's the expectation. So some of the different cultures are in this next section. The culture approaches to adolescent sexuality are, first, in Northern Europe, we see a permissive culture where basically anything goes. It's acceptable to be not just romantically but sexually involved with someone during your adolescent years. In the United States, Canada, and most of Europe, we're going to see a semi-restrictive environment where it's not as acceptable, but it's fairly common. Maybe not openly talked about acceptable, but it does happen quite a bit. And then finally, in places like East Africa, Asia, Brazil, and the Arab nations, it's restrictive. So it's a no-go. And in some of those places, there can be serious trouble if you have a sexual relationship when you're an adolescent and before marriage. Here's a good trivia question. I wish we were really face-to-face, and I would ask you, and I would want to know what your thoughts are. How many hours per day do you think teenagers use electronics or media? 3, 4 guesses? 8 hours per day. That's as many hours per day as I work most days. That's a lot. So 8 hours per day, adolescents on average use media. Research on the relationship between playing violent video games and aggressive behavior has actually been mixed. So there's no conclusive evidence to say violent video games does increase aggression. You can read one study and it seems to be a very positive correlation between those two things. And then there can be another study where the correlation doesn't seem to exist at all. So it's mixed. It depends on who you ask. It depends on the study you read. Okay, like many problems with adolescence, criminal activity rises in the middle teens and peaks around 18. Obviously not with everyone, but we do see a rise in that type of risky behavior. We also see some depression issues. But let's talk an enduring period of sadness without related symptoms of depression. That's not clinical depression. That's just depressed mood. So that's what goes here, depressed mood. Here we have, this one is major depressive disorder, and that's major depressive disorder is clinically diagnosed. So that's where they would have to go in and see a psychologist, a psychiatrist, or doctor and be actually diagnosed, because there's got to be specific symptoms such as depressed mood, appetite disturbances, sleeping disturbances, fatigue, feelings of worthlessness, and feeling guilty, lonely, or worried. And we're talking about not just a day or two of that. It's going to be over a more extended period of time. As far as how many teenagers actually experienced major depressive disorder, we're talking about 3 to 7% of adolescents for the major depressive disorder, not the mood, the depressed mood. The most common causes of depressed mood tend to be conflict with friends or family, disappointment or rejection in love, and poor school performance, stress in school, that sort of thing. And then finally, one of the strongest risk factors of all types of depression in adolescence is being female. Sadly, if you're a girl, you're at a higher risk for depression than guys. And one explanation is that the girls tend to ruminate. And if you've never heard that word before, it just means you think persistently about bad feelings and experiences. It goes over and over in your head. You play it over like a movie. Girls tend to do that more than guys. So ruminate. And I did link an article about the connection between depression and ruminating. And I put that article in our Canvas if you wanted to read more and look into that just for your own sake. So I can't think that there's anything else about Chapter 8 that I really wanted to say. Hopefully you got all that. Maybe you like having the audio. I know I've heard some of you do. So I wish I could give you audio on every chapter. I think that would be super helpful, and maybe as I go along and teach this class more, maybe I can add videos, and after teaching it a few more semesters, maybe I'll have a video for every chapter. Anyway, I hope it's been helpful, and good luck on Chapter 8 quiz. Feel free to use your notes. Remember, you can take the quiz twice. No reason why you shouldn't get 100 on it. And thanks for bearing with me on this. Like I said, I'm blinking a lot because the fan's blowing in my eyes. But all right, I hope that's helpful, and y'all have a great rest of whatever day you're on, and let's finish out strong on this semester.